That's what Robert Fairchild used to say every evening as he reviewed his accounts in the mahogany study of Riverside Plantation, a glass of imported brandy in one hand and a silver-tipped pen in the other. Numbers don't lie. They can't deceive, can't plot, can't betray. They simply exist. Cold, neutral, absolute. Mathematical truth in a world built on convenient fictions. Robert Fairchild trusted numbers more than he trusted people, more than he trusted his overseers, his business partners, even his own family. Numbers were predictable, controllable, safe. But what Robert Fairchild never understood, what he couldn't possibly have understood until it was far too late, was that numbers could also remember. Numbers could document. Numbers could witness every transaction, every theft, every carefully hidden crime. Numbers could accumulate like rain filling a barrel drop by drop until suddenly the weight becomes too much and everything collapses. And in the hands of the right person, someone patient, someone brilliant, someone with nothing to lose and everything to prove, numbers could destroy. This is the story of a man who was never supposed to learn to read. A man who wasn't even supposed to have a name beyond the one his master gave him. A man who discovered that the greatest weapon against an empire built on lies wasn't violence, wasn't escape, wasn't even hope. It was truth, recorded in meticulous detail across hundreds of pages in 6 leather-bound ledgers that would eventually bring an entire plantation to its knees. His name was Samuel, though for years everyone at Riverside Plantation simply called him the accountant. And by the time Robert Fairchild realized what Samuel had been doing with those ledgers, recording in the shadows while pretending to be nothing more than a useful tool, it was already far too late to stop what was coming. The numbers had been waiting, watching, remembering, and they were about to speak. Samuel arrived at Riverside Plantation on a Tuesday morning in September 1842 at the age of 7. He came from a smaller farm upriver that had fallen into bankruptcy after 2 years of failed crops and mounting debts, part of a group of 12 people sold to settle what the previous owner owed to his creditors. The transaction was conducted on the front lawn of the failing farm, under a spreading oak tree, with the efficiency of livestock being transferred from one pen to another. Samuel was small for his age, rail-thin from insufficient food, with eyes that seemed too large for his narrow face. Eyes that watched everything even when he kept his head obediently down. Eyes that noticed things other children missed, the way the auctioneer's assistant miscounted the group twice before getting the number right, the way the prices being called out didn't match the figures being written down on the ledger, the way numbers seemed to exist in their own world, separate from the chaos of human emotions surrounding them. Most of the overseers at Riverside barely registered his presence those first few months. Just another child who would eventually be put to work in the fields once he grew strong enough to handle a cotton sack or wield a hoe for 12 hours under the merciless South Carolina sun. Robert Fairchild himself didn't even look at the boy during the purchase. He was too busy negotiating the price per head with the creditors, trying to drive the cost down by pointing out various deficiencies in the group being offered. "That one's too old," Fairchild had said, gesturing dismissively toward a gray-haired man. "Won't get 5 good years out of him. And those 2 children are practically useless for at least another 3 years. I'm taking on dead weight here." The creditor had shrugged. "Then don't buy them. I've got 2 other interested parties coming tomorrow." It was a bluff. Everyone knew it was a bluff, but Fairchild had paid anyway. 12 people for 8,400 clone. $700 each, averaged out, though of course some were valued higher than others in the actual accounting. Samuel, being small and young, was probably worth no more than $300 in Fairchild's mental calculations. An investment that might pay off in 10 years if the boy survived and grew strong. Fairchild had no idea he was purchasing the instrument of his own destruction for a bargain price. Samuel was assigned to the children's group at first, the ones too young for full field work, but old enough to be useful. They fetched water, carried firewood, helped in the kitchens, ran messages between the overseer and the main house. simple tasks that freed up the adults for more valuable labor. But Samuel had a gift that no one at Riverside knew about yet. A gift that would have terrified anyone who understood its implications. He could count. Not just simple counting. Any child could count to 10 or 20 on their fingers. Samuel could calculate. He could see patterns in numbers the way other people saw patterns in weather or seasons. He could remember long strings of figures with perfect accuracy, could add and subtract and even multiply in his head with a speed that seemed almost supernatural, though there was nothing supernatural about it at all. Just an unusual mind that happened to work in mathematical language. His mother had noticed it first, back at the farm where he'd been born. She'd been terrified, actually, because abilities like that could be dangerous for someone in their position. Smart children asked questions. Smart children noticed inconsistencies. Smart children could become problems. "Don't let them see," she'd whispered to him on their last night together. The night before, she was sold separately to a plantation in Georgia, sent away because she'd grown weak, and the previous owner needed quick cash, more than he needed workers who couldn't perform at full capacity. "Don't ever let them know what you can do with those numbers, Samuel. Promise me." Samuel, only 7 years old, hadn't fully understood why his mother was so frightened. But he'd seen the fear in her eyes, had felt her hands trembling as she held his face, and he'd promised, "I won't tell. I'll keep it secret. Not just secret, invisible. Pretend you're slow. Pretend you can barely count to 10. They can't know, baby. They can never know." Those were the last words his mother ever spoke to him. She was gone the next morning, sold for $200 to a man who didn't even bother to record her name, just wrote, "One female, aged approx 30 field worker," in his ledger. Samuel never saw her again. For 2 years at Riverside, he kept that promise. He worked in the kitchens at first, fetching water from the well, carrying firewood from the pile behind the quarters to the cooking fires, scrubbing pots until his small hands were raw. He watched, and he listened, and he counted everything, always silently, always in his head where no one could see. He counted the meals prepared each day. 23 people working in and around the main house, receiving 1 meal of cornmeal mush and whatever scraps came back from the Fairchild family's table. 67 people in the fields, receiving 2 meals, morning and evening, of the same cornmeal supplemented with salt pork once a week. He counted the supplies that arrived. Deliveries came every Tuesday and Friday. Flour, sugar, coffee for the main house, cornmeal and salt pork for everyone else. Fabric for clothing twice a year, tools and equipment as needed. He counted the people who disappeared. 3 in his first year at Riverside, 1 old woman who died of fever in the winter, 1 young man who was sold after breaking his leg and healing improperly, 1 girl about Samuel's age who simply vanished one day and was never spoken of again. Though Samuel heard whispered conversations that made him understand she'd run away and been caught and sold south to a harsher place as punishment. And he counted the new arrivals who came to replace those who left. 4 people in that first year, purchased at various prices that Samuel overheard the overseers discussing. He counted discrepancies. That was the key, really. Not just counting things, but noticing when the numbers didn't match. When Fairchild's overseer claimed 32 bushels of corn had been used for the week's rations, but Samuel had watched only 28 bushels actually distributed. When the supply wagon arrived with 40 sacks of cornmeal, but the inventory book recorded 45. When Fairchild purchased 4 people, but only 3 appeared at Riverside, the 4th presumably sold elsewhere for a quick profit that wouldn't appear in any official records. Samuel noticed all of it. And because he was 7, then 8, then 9 years old, because he was small and quiet and kept his eyes down and never caused trouble, no one noticed him noticing. No one except Martha, the head cook, who'd taken a liking to the quiet boy who worked efficiently and never complained. "You got something special in that head of yours," Martha had said to him one evening when they were alone in the kitchen. "Everyone else already gone to the quarters for the night. I see you counting. See your lips moving sometimes, doing figures. Samuel's heart had nearly stopped. He'd been so careful, but apparently not careful enough. He'd started to deny it, but Martha had held up a hand. Hush now. I ain't gonna tell nobody. But you be more careful here. You think you being clever hiding it, but people see more than you think. And what you got, that gift with numbers, that could be useful or it could be dangerous, depending on who knows about it. My mama said to keep it secret. Your mama was smart. But Samuel... Martha had knelt down so she was eye level with him, her weathered face serious. Sometimes secrets need to come out at the right time, not now. You too young now, and it wouldn't serve nothing but getting you sold away or worse. But someday maybe that gift of yours could mean something, could do something. You understand? Samuel hadn't understood, not really, but he'd nodded anyway. Good boy. Now go on to bed. And Samuel, practice your counting in your head where nobody can see. Get so good at it that numbers become like breathing. Because if the time ever comes when you need that gift, you're gonna need to be better at it than anybody expects. It was Martha who taught him his letters secretly over the course of the next 2 years. Not proper reading. That would have been too dangerous if discovered, but enough that he could recognize written numbers and basic words. She'd use a stick to draw figures in the ash of the cooling cooking fire, showing him how to write 1, 2, 3, how those symbols corresponded to the quantities in his head. Why are you helping me? Samuel had asked once. Martha had been quiet for a long time. Had a son once. She'd finally said, about your age. He was smart too smart. Started asking questions about things he seen, things that didn't add up. Overseer heard him talking, told the master, and she'd trailed off, but her meaning was clear. So maybe I'm helping you because I couldn't help him. Maybe I'm helping you because someone with a gift like yours shouldn't have to hide it forever. Or maybe I'm just a foolish old woman. Don't matter. Just learn what I'm teaching you, and keep your mouth shut about it. By the time Samuel was 9 years old, he could write all the numbers from 0 to 1,000. He could do addition and subtraction on paper, though he was still faster in his head. He could recognize about 50 written words, mostly related to quantities and measurements: bushel, pound, dollar, paid, owed. And he was beginning to understand something that would change the course of his life. The entire plantation operated on numbers. Everything was calculated, measured, valued in dollars and cents. And those numbers were recorded in ledgers that lived in Robert Fairchild's study. Samuel had seen the ledgers, of course. He cleaned the study twice a week, dusting the shelves and sweeping the floor, while Fairchild was out inspecting the fields or conducting business in Charleston. The ledgers sat on a shelf behind the desk, large, leather-bound books with dates written on their spines in gold lettering. Samuel had never dared to open them. Not then. The risk was too great, and he wouldn't have been able to understand most of what was written in them anyway. But he'd thought about them, wondered what secrets those books contained, what the numbers inside them might reveal if someone knew how to read them properly. It was in the spring of 1844, when Samuel was 9 years old, that everything changed. The moment that would set him on the path to becoming the accountant. He was carrying a bucket of water through the yard on a warm April morning. The kind of morning when the air smelled like flowers and possibility, when he heard shouting coming from the main house, loud, angry shouting that made Samuel freeze in place, water sloshing over the bucket's rim. Through the open window of the study, he could see Robert Fairchild and another man, Thomas, the free black man who came from Charleston twice a week to manage the plantation's accounts. Thomas was educated, could read and write and calculate, and Fairchild paid him a small wage to keep the books in order because Fairchild himself didn't have the patience for detailed bookkeeping. But right now Fairchild looked anything but pleased with Thomas's work. "These numbers don't balance," Fairchild was shouting, slamming his palm on the desk hard enough that the inkpot jumped. "I purchased 40 barrels of molasses in January, Thomas. 40 barrels. According to your books, we should still have 22 barrels remaining. I have my foreman telling me we have only 16 barrels in the storehouse." Thomas was sweating despite the mild temperature, flipping through pages frantically, his hands shaking slightly. "Sir, I've recorded every distribution exactly as you reported it to me." "Then either you're incompetent or someone is stealing from me. 6 barrels don't just vanish into thin air. Perhaps if we review the distribution records—" "I don't pay you to make excuses, Thomas. I pay you to keep accurate books, and clearly you're failing at that basic task." Samuel stood frozen by the window, knowing he should move along, knowing that being caught listening to his master's business could result in punishment. But something about the numbers Fairchild had just mentioned made him pause, made his mind automatically start calculating even though he knew he shouldn't. 40 barrels purchased. 22 should remain according to the books, but only 16 actually exist. 6 barrels missing. His mind worked through the problem the way it always did with numbers, pulling up memories with the same precision that Fairchild's ledgers should have maintained but apparently didn't. January purchase, 40 barrels. Samuel remembered the delivery, remembered counting them as they were unloaded from the wagon. 40 barrels confirmed. February. Samuel had watched Martha use 3 barrels for the big dinner party Fairchild had hosted for business associates from Charleston. Expensive desserts, elaborate dishes that required molasses. 3 barrels, recorded properly in Thomas's books according to what Fairchild was saying. March. 4 barrels had been distributed to the field workers as part of their monthly rations, something Fairchild did occasionally, when he was in a generous mood or trying to encourage better work during the busy season. 4 barrels, also properly recorded. That was 7 barrels used. 40 minus 7 equals 33. But Fairchild's book said only 18 had been used, leaving 22, and reality showed only 16 remaining. The discrepancy wasn't Thomas's fault. The discrepancy existed because someone had taken 6 barrels without reporting it, and Samuel knew exactly when that had happened. Late one night in February, Samuel had been awakened by the sound of a wagon in the yard. He'd peered out through a crack in the wall of the quarters and had seen 5 or 6 barrels. He couldn't be certain of the exact number in the darkness, being loaded onto a wagon by Fairchild's nephew Charles, who managed the plantation's cotton sales in Charleston and visited Riverside occasionally. Samuel had thought nothing of it at the time. Masters and their families moved goods around all the time. It wasn't his business to question why or where. But now, doing the mathematics in his head, Samuel understood. Those barrels had been taken by Charles, taken without being recorded in the books, either sold for personal profit or used for some other purpose that Fairchild didn't know about or had conveniently forgotten about when it came time to account for the discrepancy. The missing barrels weren't stolen by workers. They'd been taken by family, and Thomas was about to be blamed for a theft he hadn't committed and a discrepancy he hadn't created. Samuel stood there in the warm spring sunlight, water bucket heavy in his small hands, and faced a choice. He could walk away, say nothing, let Thomas take the blame. It wasn't Samuel's problem. Getting involved would only draw attention to himself, would risk revealing the one thing his mother had made him promise to keep hidden, or he could speak up. Risk everything for the sake of a man he barely knew, for the sake of truth, for the sake of numbers that didn't lie even when people did. Samuel had no idea that this single moment would define the rest of his life, that the choice he was about to make would set in motion a chain of events that would eventually destroy Robert Fairchild and everything he'd built. All Samuel knew was that watching an innocent man be blamed for something that wasn't his fault felt wrong in a way that made his stomach hurt. But in the end, on that spring morning in 1844, Samuel said nothing. He walked away before anyone noticed him, poured the water where it needed to go, and returned to his work with his heart pounding and his mind racing. He was 9 years old, too young, too powerless. Speaking up would have accomplished nothing except getting himself in trouble. But as he worked through the rest of that day, scrubbing pots in the kitchen while Martha hummed a quiet song, Samuel couldn't stop thinking about those numbers, about the injustice of Thomas being blamed, about the way Fairchild didn't even consider that his own family might be the source of the problem, about the way numbers could tell a story that people didn't want to hear. 3 days later, Thomas was dismissed, Fairchild accused him of poor record-keeping at best, possible complicity and theft at worst. The man left Riverside Plantation in disgrace, his reputation damaged, unlikely to find similar work again in Charleston, where everyone would hear about his supposed incompetence. Samuel watched him leave from the kitchen window, saw the way Thomas's shoulders slumped as he loaded his few possessions into a small cart, and felt something harden in his chest, something cold and determined. He couldn't fix what had happened to Thomas, but he could remember it, could learn from it, could make sure that someday the truth hidden in those numbers would matter. Samuel didn't know how yet. He was 9 years old, barely educated, legally classified as property rather than a person. He had no power, no authority, no realistic hope of changing anything. But he had a gift. He had numbers. And he had time. That night, lying on the hard floor of the quarters where he slept, Samuel made a decision that would shape the next 16 years of his life. He would learn everything he could about numbers, about accounting, about the way plantations tracked their operations. And someday, when the opportunity arose, if it ever arose, he would use that knowledge for something that mattered. He didn't know yet that he would become Robert Fairchild's bookkeeper. Didn't know that he would spend 12 years secretly documenting every crime, every theft, every hidden transaction that passed through Riverside Plantation. Didn't know that his patience and his precision with numbers would eventually bring the entire operation crashing down. All he knew was that numbers didn't lie. And he was very, very good with numbers. For 6 months after Thomas's dismissal, Riverside Plantation operated without a proper bookkeeper. Robert Fairchild tried to manage the accounts himself at first, sitting in his study every evening with the ledgers spread before him, a deep frown creasing his forehead as he attempted to track the countless daily transactions that kept a large plantation functioning. It was harder than he'd anticipated. Much harder. Fairchild understood profit and loss in broad strokes. He knew when he was making money or losing it, knew roughly what his cotton crop should fetch at market, understood the basic economics of his operation. But the daily details, the endless calculations of supplies purchased and distributed, goods sold and services rendered, workers maintained and equipped, it overwhelmed him quickly. He would sit at his desk for hours, trying to balance columns that refused to balance, searching for arithmetic errors that multiplied the more frustrated he became. His handwriting would deteriorate as the evening wore on, numbers becoming increasingly illegible, scratch-outs and corrections making the pages look chaotic rather than precise. His wife, Eleanor, would watch from the doorway with barely concealed concern. "You should hire someone from Charleston, Robert, a proper clerk. Someone educated who can manage this properly." "I don't need some overpaid clerk," Fairchild would snap, not looking up from his calculations. "I'm perfectly capable of maintaining my own books." But he wasn't, and Eleanor knew it. And increasingly, so did Fairchild, though he was too proud to admit it. "Thomas managed these accounts for 3 years without issue," Eleanor persisted one evening, trying a different approach. "Surely there's another capable person in Charleston who—" "Thomas was incompetent. That's why I dismissed him. Thomas made one mistake, Robert. One discrepancy in 3 years of otherwise flawless work. And you never did determine where those barrels actually went." Fairchild's jaw tightened. "Are you suggesting I was wrong to dismiss him?" "I'm suggesting that hiring a bookkeeper isn't an admission of weakness. It's good business sense. You have more important matters to attend to than adding columns of figures every night, and pay Charleston wages to some clerk who'll probably cheat me, just like Thomas did. No, I'll manage my own affairs, Eleanor. The subject is closed." Eleanor knew better than to push further when her husband used that tone. She withdrew from the doorway, leaving Fairchild alone with his books and his pride. But the problems continued. Suppliers began complaining about late payments or disputed invoices. Cotton buyers in Charleston raised questions about discrepancies in the quantities Fairchild claimed to be producing. The plantation's foreman started reporting supplies that should have been available according to Fairchild's records, but somehow weren't actually in the storehouse. It was during this time, in the autumn of 1844, that Samuel began to see an opportunity. He was 10 years old now, a bit taller, still working primarily in and around the main house. He'd progressed from basic kitchen work to more general household tasks, cleaning, running errands, assisting with various duties as needed. It was the kind of position that gave him access to many parts of the plantation, including the main house itself, where he could observe Fairchild's growing frustration with the accounts. Samuel watched with keen interest every time he cleaned the study, noting the disorganization of the ledgers, the obvious errors in Fairchild's calculations, the mounting chaos of the financial records. He began to understand that this wasn't just a temporary inconvenience for Fairchild. The man was genuinely struggling, and that struggle was affecting the entire plantation's operations. Martha noticed Samuel's interest, of course. She noticed everything about the quiet boy who'd become like a son to her in the 2 years since he'd arrived at Riverside. "Dangerous thoughts you're having," she murmured to him one evening as they worked together in the kitchen, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can see them in your eyes, Samuel. You're thinking about those books in the study." Samuel didn't bother denying it. "Master Fairchild needs help with the accounts. Master Fairchild needs a lot of things. Doesn't mean he should get them from a 10-year-old boy who ain't supposed to know how to count past his fingers. But I do know how. And I'm good at it, Martha. Better than he is. That's exactly why it's dangerous, child. You show them what you can do and maybe they find you useful. But useful can be just as risky as useless in a place like this. Useful means valuable. Valuable means you'll never be let go. Never be sold. Never have a chance at freedom because you're too valuable to lose." Samuel considered this. He'd thought about freedom occasionally, the way all enslaved people did, but it seemed so impossibly distant that it barely felt real. Freedom was something that happened to other people, or didn't happen at all. It wasn't something he could reasonably hope for or plan toward. But being useful, being valuable in a way that kept him close to the center of Riverside's operations, close to information and opportunities, that seemed more achievable, more within his control. "What if I want to be useful?" he asked quietly. Martha sighed, her weathered hands stilling in their work. "Then you're braver or more foolish than I thought. Maybe both." She was quiet for a moment, then added, "If you're gonna do this and I can see in your face you've already decided, then do it smart. Don't just show them you can add and subtract. Show them you're better than any clerk they could hire from Charleston. Show them you're worth the risk of teaching, worth the scandal of having a slave boy manage their books." "How?" "Wait for the right moment. Don't push. Don't volunteer. Wait until he's desperate enough that your solution looks like a gift from God rather than a challenge to his authority. Men like Fairchild don't like being shown up by people they consider beneath them. But they do like being rescued from their own incompetence, as long as the rescue doesn't make them look weak." It was good advice. Samuel took it to heart. He continued his work, continued watching Fairchild struggle with the accounts, continued waiting for the right moment. That moment came on a cold afternoon in late November, almost 6 months after Thomas's dismissal. Samuel was cleaning the study, dusting shelves, sweeping floors, emptying the ash from the fireplace, when Fairchild sat down at his desk with the current ledger and a stack of receipts that needed to be recorded. Samuel could tell from the man's posture, from the heaviness of his movements, that it had been a difficult day. Indeed, he'd overheard the foreman earlier reporting that 3 field workers had collapsed from illness, that one of the cotton wagons had broken an axle, and that a shipment of supplies from Charleston had arrived with several items missing or damaged. Problems that needed to be solved, decisions that needed to be made, and now accounting that needed to be done when Fairchild was already exhausted. Samuel worked quietly in the corner, making himself as invisible as possible, while Fairchild began the laborious process of recording the day's transactions. He could see the man's frustration mounting as he tried to add columns of figures, getting different totals each time, scratching out errors, starting over. After 20 minutes, Fairchild threw his pen down on the desk with enough force to splatter ink. "Damn these numbers," he muttered, then louder with real anguish in his voice. Why won't they balance? Samuel knew he should stay silent. This wasn't his business. He was just a child, just a servant, just someone who was supposed to be invisible. But the numbers were right there on the desk. And even from across the room, Samuel could see the error, could see exactly why the columns weren't balancing, could fix it in seconds if given the chance. His mother's voice echoed in his memory. Don't let them see. Don't ever let them know. But Martha's voice was there too. Wait for the right moment. Wait until he's desperate enough. Samuel made his decision. The error is in column 3, sir, he said quietly, not looking up from his sweeping. His heart hammered so hard he could feel it in his throat. You added the February cotton sales twice. Once on page 12 and again on page 15. The study went completely silent. Samuel continued sweeping, forcing his hands to stay steady even though every instinct screamed at him to run. He'd just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Either this would work, or it would end very badly. When Fairchild finally spoke, his voice was strange, controlled but with an undercurrent of something dangerous. What did you say? The February sales, sir. They're recorded twice in different places. If you subtract the second entry, your total will balance. More silence. Then the sound of pages turning. Samuel dared to glance up and saw Fairchild staring at the ledger, his finger tracing down the columns. Page 12. Then page 15. His expression shifted from confusion to disbelief to something else. Something calculating. These are... You're correct. Fairchild looked up at Samuel with eyes that suddenly seemed to see him for the first time as something other than part of the furniture. How did you know that? Can you read these numbers? This was the moment, the point of no return. Yes, sir. I can read numbers. All of them. Who taught you? No one taught me, sir. I just understand them. I always have. Fairchild stood slowly, walking around the desk to stand directly in front of Samuel. The boy forced himself not to flinch, not to show fear, even though Fairchild was tall and imposing, and Samuel was small, and had just admitted to something that could be considered dangerous or threatening, depending on how the master chose to interpret it. You can read and calculate, Fairchild said slowly, as if testing the idea. A child. He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air. A slave child. Someone who shouldn't have these abilities. Someone who definitely shouldn't be displaying them. Yes, sir. Prove it. Fairchild returned to his desk, flipping to a page near the middle of the ledger. The total at the bottom of page 23. Add it to the total at the bottom of page 26. Tell me the sum. Samuel had already seen those pages during his cleaning, had already noticed those numbers the way he noticed all numbers. His mind had already done the calculation automatically. $7,843, sir. Fairchild checked the pages. His expression shifted to something like awe. That's exactly right. How did you calculate that so quickly? I saw the pages when I was cleaning earlier, sir. I remember the numbers. You remember them? From hours ago? Yes, sir. Numbers stay in my head once I've seen them. Fairchild sat back down slowly, his eyes never leaving Samuel's face. The boy could practically see the calculations happening behind those eyes. Not mathematical calculations, but practical ones. Value assessments, risk versus reward, opportunity versus scandal. Can you write? Fairchild asked finally. No, sir, not well. I know my numbers written down in a few words, but I can't write properly. But you could learn. I believe so, sir, if someone taught me. The study fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now, not dangerous but contemplative. Fairchild was thinking, weighing options, seeing possibilities that hadn't existed 5 minutes ago. Finally, he asked the question that would change both their lives. Would you like to help me with these books, boy? Learn to do this properly? Samuel knew what this meant. It meant being pulled out of the normal work routines. It meant special treatment that would make some people jealous and others suspicious. It meant being noticed, being watched, being valuable in a way that could become its own kind of prison. But it also meant access. Information. Understanding the inner workings of the plantation in a way no other enslaved person would ever have. It meant power of a sort. The power that comes from knowing things others don't know. "Yes, sir," Samuel said quietly. "I would like that very much. Then we'll begin tomorrow. 1 hour each evening. I'll teach you to write properly, and you'll help me with these accounts." "But Samuel," Fairchild's voice took on a warning tone, "this arrangement stays between us. You don't speak of it to the other servants. You don't boast about it. You simply do the work I assign you and nothing more. Understood?" "Yes, sir. I understand." "Good. Now finish your cleaning and go about your regular duties. Tomorrow evening, we begin." Samuel completed his work and left the study, his mind reeling. He'd done it. He'd taken the first step on a path that would eventually lead to something he couldn't yet imagine, something that would take 12 more years to fully unfold. When he returned to the quarters that evening and found Martha waiting with his dinner, a bowl of thin soup and a piece of cornbread, she took one look at his face and knew something had changed. "You did it," she said simply. "You showed him. I showed him. And I start tomorrow. He's going to teach me to write, going to let me help with the accounting." Martha was quiet for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she pulled Samuel into a rare embrace, holding him tight enough that he could feel her trembling slightly. "Then you be smart about this, you hear me? Smarter than you've ever been. Learn everything he'll teach you. Become so good at this that he can't imagine doing without you. But Samuel," she pulled back to look him in the eyes, "don't ever forget what we are to them. Don't let his teaching make you think you're special or safe or anything other than property that happens to be useful. The moment you stop being useful, or the moment you become threatening, all this will end. And that ending might not be gentle. I know. Do you? Really?" Samuel thought about that, about what he was getting into, about the risks and the limited rewards, about the fact that no matter how valuable he became, he would still be enslaved, still be property, still be subject to Fairchild's whims and moods and needs. "I know," he said again, "but Martha, even if I'm just property to him, even if this doesn't change what I am, at least I'll understand. I'll see how everything works. I'll know things, and maybe someday knowing things will matter." Martha studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You got your mama's eyes," she said quietly. "Seeing things, understanding things. I just hope you got more luck than she did too." They didn't speak of it again that night, but as Samuel lay down to sleep, his mind was already racing ahead, already thinking about what he would learn, what he would see, what opportunities might present themselves. He had no way of knowing that this was the beginning of something that would eventually destroy Robert Fairchild's entire operation, that the trust Fairchild was placing in him would become the weapon that brought everything crashing down. All Samuel knew was that tomorrow he would start learning to write, learning to keep proper accounts, learning to navigate the world of plantation bookkeeping from the inside. And in learning those things, he would discover something that would define his entire life. That information carefully gathered and meticulously recorded could become more powerful than any act of rebellion or resistance. Numbers didn't lie, but they could wait. They could accumulate in the shadows. They could be patient. And so could Samuel. The transformation happened gradually, over months, and then years, so slowly that even people who saw Samuel every day didn't fully register what was occurring. It started with the evening lessons. Every day as the sun set and the field workers returned to their quarters, Samuel would present himself at the study door. Fairchild would admit him, and for 1 hour, precisely 1 hour timed by the clock on the mantel, they would work together on writing and accounting. Fairchild proved to be a surprisingly patient teacher when it suited his purposes. He started with the basics, proper penmanship, how to form letters clearly and consistently, how to write numbers in a way that couldn't be misread even years later when the ink had faded. These were foundational skills for bookkeeping, and Fairchild drilled them relentlessly. "A ledger is worthless if it can't be read," he would say, watching Samuel practice writing the same numbers over and over on sheets of paper. "Your 7 must never look like a 9. Your 5 must never look like a 3. Clarity is everything in accounting." Samuel absorbed these lessons with the same focused intensity he brought to everything involving numbers. His handwriting improved rapidly, becoming neat and precise, every character formed with careful deliberation. After 2 weeks of pure writing practice, Fairchild introduced him to the structure of double-entry bookkeeping, the system by which every transaction was recorded twice, once as a debit and once as a credit, ensuring that the accounts always balanced. It was elegant in its logic, and Samuel understood it almost immediately. "Every dollar that comes in must be accounted for," Fairchild explained, showing Samuel how to record a cotton sale. "The money enters the cash account here, that's a debit, and it's balanced by a credit here in the cotton sales account. See? The total debits always equal the total credits. If they don't balance, you know there's an error somewhere. Or a theft," Samuel said without thinking, then immediately wished he could take the words back. But Fairchild just gave a slight smile. "Or a theft, yes. That's why this system is valuable. It makes theft visible, as long as the bookkeeper is honest, and the records are complete." Samuel filed that observation away. As long as the bookkeeper is honest, as long as the records are complete. By December, 3 months into the arrangement, Samuel was making simple entries in the official ledgers under Fairchild's supervision, recording supply deliveries, noting payments made and received, building a working understanding of how the plantation's finances flowed. And all the while, he was learning things that Fairchild never intended to teach him. He was learning the economics of slavery itself, the cold calculations that reduced human beings to numbers in a ledger book. Each person at Riverside had a value assigned to them, recorded in the asset ledger. Field workers worth between $800 and $200 depending on age, health, and skill. Skilled workers like the blacksmith and carpenter valued higher, sometimes as much as $1,500. Children valued lower, their prices increasing as they aged and became capable of more labor. Samuel saw his own name in those records for the first time when he was 11 years old, recording asset inventories with Fairchild's guidance. Samuel, house servant, age 11, value $400. $400. That's what his life was worth in Robert Fairchild's accounting. Less than half the value of a healthy adult field worker. Roughly the same price as 2 good horses or 8 head of cattle. He stared at that number for a long moment, feeling something cold settle in his chest. Then he copied it neatly into the current year's ledger and moved on to the next entry, his face carefully neutral. By his 12th birthday in 1845, Samuel was handling most of the daily bookkeeping independently. Fairchild would review his work each evening, checking for errors, occasionally making corrections, but increasingly trusting Samuel's accuracy. The boy had proven himself to be not just capable, but exceptional, faster and more precise than Thomas had ever been, and certainly far better than Fairchild himself. The arrangement raised eyebrows among the plantation's white overseers and staff. A slave child managing the account books. It was irregular, possibly scandalous, definitely strange. But Fairchild dismissed any concerns with confident authority. "The boy has a gift for figures," he would say. "It would be foolish not to use it, and he's supervised at all times. There's no risk of impropriety." What Fairchild didn't say, what he perhaps didn't fully recognize, was that he had become dependent on Samuel's skill. The accounts had never been more organized, more accurate, more reliable. For the first time in years, Fairchild could look at his ledgers and know exactly where his plantation stood financially. And Samuel noticed everything. He noticed when Fairchild began entertaining guests from Charleston more frequently, wealthy men interested in investing in Riverside's expansion. He recorded the investments that came in: $15,000 from a textile merchant, $8,000 from a banker, $12,000 from a shipping company owner. all of it carefully documented in the books as capital contributions to be repaid with interest from future cotton profits. He noticed when Fairchild purchased additional land in 1846, expanding Riverside by 200 acres at a cost of $6,000. And when Fairchild purchased 15 more workers to cultivate that new land, spending another $14,000 at various auctions. He noticed when the debts began to accumulate. Loans from banks in Charleston to cover expansion costs, notes payable to suppliers, interest charges that mounted month by month. And most significantly, Samuel noticed when Fairchild began recording numbers that didn't quite match reality. It started small. A cotton shipment recorded as 30 bales, when Samuel had counted only 28 being loaded onto the wagon. Supply costs recorded as $150 when the actual receipt showed $165. Minor discrepancies that might have been simple mistakes, the kind of small errors that happen in any business. But they kept happening, and they always skewed in the same direction, making Riverside appear more profitable than it actually was. By 1847, when Samuel was 13 years old, he had begun to understand something profound. Robert Fairchild was lying. Not constantly, not about everything, but frequently enough to create a fictional version of Riverside Plantation's finances that looked considerably healthier than the reality. And Samuel was the one recording those lies in the official ledgers. At first, he didn't know what to do with this knowledge. He was 13 years old, still learning, still developing his understanding of how businesses operated and what constituted fraud versus normal business practices. Maybe this was just how plantations worked. Maybe everyone did this. But the more he learned, the more certain he became that what Fairchild was doing wasn't normal. It was deception. It was fraud. And it was getting worse as the debts mounted and the pressure to show profits increased. It was during this period, in late 1847, that Samuel made a decision that would define the next 13 years of his life. He would begin keeping his own records. A second set of books that told the true story of Riverside Plantation's finances and operations. Not to do anything with immediately, he had no power, no authority, no way to use such information, but to document, to preserve, to create a record that might someday matter. He started small and carefully. Fairchild had given him a small room adjacent to the study, barely more than a closet really, but it had a narrow bed, a small table, and enough space to call his own. More privacy than most enslaved people at Riverside ever had. Samuel used that privacy to begin his secret accounting project. He couldn't risk keeping full ledgers. They would be too obvious if discovered. Instead, he started with a single notebook, small enough to hide easily, in which he recorded discrepancies and observations. When the official ledger showed one number but Samuel knew the reality was different, he noted it. When Fairchild made a decision that seemed questionable, Samuel documented it. The first entry, dated November 15, 1847, was simple. Official books show cotton yield 847 bales, actual count 809 bales. Difference 38 bales reported but not produced. Price per bale $45. False profit claimed $1,710. The second entry, 2 weeks later, Master F recorded payment of $230 to blacksmith for equipment repairs. Actual payment $180. Difference $50. Unknown where money went. Entry by entry, week by week, month by month, Samuel built his secret accounting of Riverside Plantation. He developed his own shorthand, his own code, ways of recording information that would look like meaningless scratch work to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. And he was careful, extraordinarily careful. He never wrote when anyone might see, never left his notebook anywhere it might be found. He developed a loose floorboard under his bed where he could hide his documentation, checking it obsessively to ensure it remained secure. By 1849, when Samuel was 15 years old, he had filled his first small notebook completely and started a second. The scope of his documentation had expanded beyond just financial discrepancies. He'd begun recording something else, something that would later prove even more important than the fraud he was documenting. He recorded the people, not as Fairchild recorded them, as property values in an asset ledger. Samuel recorded them as human beings, their names, their ages, where they'd come from, their families, their skills and personalities and hopes, to the extent that he could learn these things through careful observation and quiet conversations. And most importantly, he recorded what happened to them. When 16-year-old David was sold to a plantation in Mississippi in spring of 1849, the official ledgers recorded, sale of one male field worker, age 16, price $950. Samuel's notebook recorded, David, son of Margaret and Paul, sold to Trader Hammond for transport to Mississippi. Fairchild reported sale price $950, but actually received $100. Difference $150 unreported income. David's family not informed until after sale completed. When elderly Ruth died during the harsh winter of 1849-1850, Fairchild's ledger recorded a loss of property value. One female, aged approximately 60, died. Asset value written down, $100. Samuel's notebook recorded, Ruth, age 63, worked at Riverside for 28 years, died of pneumonia, deck 24, requested medical attention 3 times in week before death. Master F refused, saying, not worth the expense for someone her age. Cost of doctor visit, $5. Value of labor extracted from Ruth over 28 years, estimated $22,000. Page by page, person by person, Samuel built a historical record that existed nowhere else. A testament to lives lived and struggles endured. Names that would have been forgotten, stories that would have been lost. He did this partially for practical reasons. These details might prove useful as documentation of Fairchild's misdeeds. But he also did it for a deeper reason that he couldn't quite articulate even to himself. He did it because these people deserve to be remembered as people, not as numbers in an asset column. Because their lives had meaning beyond their economic value to Robert Fairchild. Because Samuel himself was in those same ledgers, reduced to a dollar amount, and he understood viscerally what it felt like to be counted, but not seen, valued but not respected, recorded but not remembered. Martha noticed the change in Samuel as he grew older, noticed the way he would sometimes get a distant look in his eyes, as if he were seeing something no one else could see. You carrying something heavy, she observed one evening when Samuel was 17, helping her prepare the next day's meals. Can see it in the way you move. What you carrying, child? Samuel was quiet for a long time. He trusted Martha more than anyone else at Riverside, but even so, telling her about his secret documentation felt dangerous. The fewer people who knew, the safer the information would be. But Martha wasn't just anyone. She'd taught him his first letters. She'd encouraged him to develop his gift with numbers. She'd warned him about the risks and supported him anyway. I'm keeping records, he said finally, quietly, glancing around to ensure they were truly alone. Of everything. The real numbers, not the ones Master Fairchild wants in the books. And the people. What happens to them. Their stories. Martha went very still. Samuel, that's dangerous. If he ever found out. I know. But someone needs to remember. Someone needs to write down what's actually happening here. What you gonna do with these records? I don't know. Maybe nothing. Maybe they'll just exist, hidden away forever. But at least they'll exist. At least the truth will be written down somewhere, even if no one ever reads it. Martha studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You got your mama's courage, she said quietly. And your mama's stubbornness, too. Just be careful, Samuel. Please. You're like a son to me. I couldn't bear to see something happen to you because of this. I'm careful. I promise. And he was. For years, Samuel maintained his double existence with meticulous precision. During the day, he was Robert Fairchild's trusted bookkeeper, recording the fiction that Fairchild needed to maintain for investors and creditors. During stolen moments at night, by candlelight in his small room, he was a different kind of accountant, one who recorded truth, rather than convenient lies. By 1853, when Samuel was 19 years old, he had filled 4 notebooks with his secret documentation. He'd also graduated to proper ledgers, having carefully acquired blank ledger books through various means. One purchased with small amounts of money he'd saved from occasional tips, another found abandoned in a storeroom, a third borrowed from a supply order where Fairchild had purchased extra books and wouldn't notice one missing. These hidden ledgers were his life's work, his purpose, the thing that made the contradiction of his existence, helping Fairchild maintain lies while privately recording truth, feel meaningful rather than simply tragic. He'd organized them carefully. Ledger 1 covered 1847-1849 and contained primarily financial discrepancies and early observations. Ledger 2, 1849-1851, expanded to include more detailed documentation of people sold or deceased. Ledger 3, 1851-1853, showed Fairchild's growing financial desperation and increasingly bold fraudulent practices. Ledger 4, begun in 1853, tracked what Samuel had come to think of as the unraveling, the point at which Fairchild's debts and deceptions began to outpace his ability to cover them up. Samuel had no plan for these ledgers, no clear sense of what he hoped to achieve with them, but he maintained them with religious devotion anyway, because the alternative, letting all of this go unrecorded, letting truth dissolve into convenient forgetfulness, felt like a betrayal of something fundamental. He maintained them because numbers didn't lie, even when people did. He maintained them because someone needed to bear witness. He maintained them because someday, maybe, somehow, the truth would matter. He just had to wait, had to be patient, had to keep recording, keep documenting, keep building his mountain of evidence one entry at a time. And then in 1854, something changed. Something that would set in motion the events that would eventually bring all of Samuel's patient work to fruition. Robert Fairchild's financial situation went from difficult to desperate, and desperate men make mistakes. By 1854, Riverside Plantation was drowning in debt, though you wouldn't know it from looking at the official ledgers or observing Fairchild's public behavior. On paper, the plantation appeared prosperous, profitable crops, valuable assets, a successful operation that any investor would be pleased with. In reality, Fairchild owed approximately $67,000 to various creditors, a staggering sum that grew larger every month as interest accumulated. Samuel knew this because he tracked the true debts in his hidden ledgers, even as he recorded the sanitized version in the official books. The crisis had multiple sources. Fairchild had borrowed heavily in the early 1850s to expand Riverside's operations, purchasing land and workers with money he expected to pay back quickly through increased cotton production. But cotton prices had fluctuated unpredictably, sometimes dropping below the cost of production. Meanwhile, his expansion had created massive overhead costs. More mouths to feed, more supplies to purchase, more equipment to maintain. Compounding the problem, Fairchild lived extravagantly. He dressed in expensive clothes, served imported wines at his dinner parties, maintained a stable of fine horses, and traveled frequently to Charleston to socialize with the city's elite. These expenses, which might have been sustainable for a genuinely profitable plantation, were bankrupting Riverside. But Fairchild couldn't admit the truth, couldn't scale back his lifestyle, couldn't acknowledge that his expansion had been a mistake. His social standing depended on the appearance of success. His ability to borrow more money depended on convincing lenders that Riverside was a sound investment. So he lied. And those lies became more elaborate and more dangerous as time went on. Samuel documented all of it. In March 1854, Fairchild reported a cotton yield of 1,240 bales to his investors. The actual production was 987 bales. The difference, 253 bales, represented approximately 11,185 in fictional profits that existed only on paper. In June 1854, Fairchild took out a new loan from a Charleston bank, using Riverside's valuable assets as collateral. The loan application listed 43 adult workers as part of those assets. The reality was that Fairchild had already secretly sold 8 of those people to cover previous debts, but he hadn't reported the sales to the bank. He was using property he no longer owned as collateral for new borrowing. In September 1854, Fairchild received $4,200 from investors as capital for purchasing new equipment. Instead of buying equipment, he used the money to pay overdue interest on existing loans. The equipment purchase was recorded in the books as if it had happened, with false receipts created to justify the expenditure. Each of these actions was fraudulent. Each one represented not just financial deception, but criminal behavior that could result in prison time if discovered and proven. And Samuel recorded every single instance with meticulous detail in his hidden ledgers. He recorded the dates, the amounts, the nature of each deception. He noted which investors or creditors were being deceived. He documented the real transactions that the false records were designed to hide. And when possible, he noted the names of other people who knew about or were involved in the frauds. Fairchild's nephew Charles, who frequently helped arrange secret sales. The plantation foreman, who sometimes provided false production numbers. A clerk in Charleston who created backdated receipts for a fee. By the end of 1854, Samuel's 4th ledger was nearly full, and he began a 5th. This one he organized differently, creating separate sections for different types of fraud: false production reports, unreported sales, misappropriation of investor funds, use of non-existent assets as collateral, tax evasion through underreported income. It read like an indictment, which, in a sense, it was. But Samuel still had no clear plan for what to do with this information. He was 20 years old, legally enslaved, with no standing to report crimes or testify in court. His documentation was detailed and damning, but it existed in a kind of limbo, powerful but unused, dangerous but hidden. He continued his double life. During the day, he was Fairchild's trusted bookkeeper, the man who kept the official ledgers in perfect order, who made the fraudulent numbers look legitimate and professional. By night, he was something else entirely: a secret chronicler, a witness to crimes, a collector of evidence that might never be used. The contradiction wore on him. He was complicit in Fairchild's frauds by virtue of recording them in the official books, even though he was doing so under compulsion, without choice, as an enslaved person following his master's orders. But that complicity felt heavy anyway, felt like a stain he couldn't wash away no matter how carefully he documented the truth in his hidden ledgers. Martha saw the toll it was taking. "You're tired," she said to him one evening in early 1855. Tired in a way that sleep don't fix. Samuel couldn't deny it. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore, Martha. I thought documenting everything would feel like resistance, like fighting back in the only way I could. But instead it just feels like I'm helping him lie more successfully." "You are helping him lie," Martha said bluntly. "No point pretending otherwise. You write those numbers in his books, and those numbers go out into the world, and people believe them because they look professional and legitimate. Your skill makes his fraud more effective." It was painful to hear, but Samuel needed to hear it. "So what do I do?" "Refuse to keep the books. That just gets me sold or beaten or worse. And then someone else would do the bookkeeping, and the fraud would continue, and I'd lose access to all this information. I ain't saying you should stop. I'm saying you should stop fooling yourself about what you're doing. You're not resisting right now, you're surviving. Recording things ain't the same as changing things. Writing truth in a hidden book ain't the same as speaking truth where it matters." "Then what would you have me do?" Martha was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know, child. I truly don't. Maybe there ain't nothing you can do. Maybe you just keep your head down and survive and hope that someday those books you're keeping will matter to someone. Or maybe—" She trailed off. "Maybe what?" "Maybe someday an opportunity will come. Someone who could actually use what you know. Someone with power to act on it. And maybe when that happens, you'll need to decide if survival is still the most important thing, or if you're willing to risk it all for the chance that truth might actually matter. Samuel thought about that conversation for weeks afterward. Martha was right that he was surviving rather than resisting. Right that his hidden ledgers, for all the time and effort he'd invested in them, didn't actually change anything. They were just records of injustice, not remedies for it. But what else could he do? He had no power, no authority, no legal standing. An enslaved man testifying against his master would be laughed out of any courtroom, assuming the case even made it that far. His documented evidence, no matter how thorough, was meaningless without someone who could actually use it. So he continued documenting, continued waiting, continued surviving, and the fraud continued to escalate. In 1855, Fairchild's financial situation became truly dire. Interest payments on his various debts were consuming nearly all of Riverside's actual profits. He'd borrowed as much as the Charleston banks would lend him. His investors were starting to ask uncomfortable questions about returns on their capital. He needed money, large amounts of it, quickly. That's when he began stealing from his wife's family. Eleanor Fairchild had brought a substantial dowry to the marriage, $25,000 held in trust, managed by Robert but technically belonging to her, secured by law to ensure she would have resources if he died or if the marriage dissolved. The trust was supposed to be inviolate, protected from Robert's business dealings. But in June 1855, Robert began quietly borrowing from that trust. It started with $2,000, recorded in the official books as a loan from Eleanor with her permission. Samuel knew that Eleanor hadn't given permission because he'd heard them arguing about it through the study door. "You have no right, Robert. That money is legally mine." "It's temporarily borrowed, Eleanor. An investment opportunity that will pay returns that benefit both of us. I'll repay it within 6 months. You said the same thing about the last investment opportunity and the one before that. I want my money left alone." But Eleanor had no real power to stop her husband. The law gave Robert control over her property. Her protests were noted and ignored. By the end of 1855, Robert had borrowed $8,000 from Eleanor's trust. Samuel documented each withdrawal in his hidden ledgers, noting that none of this money was used for investment opportunities as Robert claimed. Instead, it went to pay down debts, to cover interest payments, to maintain the illusion that Riverside was still solvent. In the official books, these withdrawals were recorded as legitimate loans, properly authorized, earning interest that would eventually be repaid. In Samuel's hidden ledgers, they were recorded as theft from Eleanor's legally protected trust, committed without her genuine consent, unlikely ever to be repaid. It was during this period that Samuel began to expand his documentation in a new direction. He started recording not just the frauds themselves, but potential witnesses who could verify them. When Fairchild made a secret sale of 3 workers to a trader named Colburn in September 1855, Samuel noted not just the sale itself, but every detail that might be used to verify it later. Colburn's full name and business address in Savannah, the exact date of the transaction, the prices paid for each person, $900, $100, and $850, the fact that the sales were not reported to Riverside's business partners who technically co-owned those workers. When Fairchild created a false receipt for equipment purchases in November 1855, Samuel noted which Charleston merchant's name had been forged on the receipt, making it possible for someone to verify that no such sale had actually occurred. When Fairchild instructed Samuel to record a cotton shipment of 43 bales in January 1856, but Samuel had personally counted only 37 bales loaded onto the wagon. He documented the names of the wagon drivers and dock workers who could potentially testify to the actual quantity shipped. Samuel was building a case. Not consciously, not with any clear plan for how it would ever be presented or to whom, but the instinct to document thoroughly, to create verifiable proof, to anticipate what an investigator or prosecutor might need, that instinct guided him even when he had no reason to believe anyone would ever investigate. By mid-1856, Samuel was maintaining 6 hidden ledgers, each focused on different aspects of Riverside's operations. Ledger 1, financial frauds and misrepresentations to investors and creditors. Ledger 2. Unreported sales and use of non-existent assets as collateral. Ledger 3. Misappropriation of Eleanor's trust fund. Ledger 4. Tax evasion through underreported income. Ledger 5. Personal records of people sold, separated, or deceased. Ledger 6. Potential witnesses and verification sources for various frauds. He'd developed a sophisticated hiding system. The floorboard under his bed concealed 3 of the ledgers. 2 more were hidden inside a hollowed-out section of the wall, behind a loose board. The 6th he kept in a waterproof cloth, wrapping buried in a jar beneath the floor of the kitchen storehouse, where Martha knew about it, but no one else would think to look. He'd also created a primitive index system, allowing him to cross-reference entries between ledgers. If someone wanted to understand a particular fraud, Samuel could point them to the relevant pages across multiple books, showing how different pieces of evidence connected and corroborated each other. It was, in its way, a masterpiece of accounting and documentation, far more sophisticated than the official ledgers that Fairchild and the investors relied on. And Samuel continued to add to it, entry by entry, day by day, even as the futility of his project weighed on him more heavily with each passing month. What was the point? What could these ledgers ever accomplish when he had no way to use them? No audience to present them to, no legal standing to make them matter. The question haunted him through 1856 and into 1857. He was 23 years old, had been documenting Fairchild's crimes for nearly a decade, and had nothing to show for it except 6 hidden ledgers that would probably be destroyed if they were ever discovered. He thought about giving up sometimes, about burning the ledgers, destroying the evidence, relieving himself of the burden of carrying these secrets, about just being what Fairchild thought he was, a useful tool, valuable property, nothing more. But he couldn't bring himself to do it, couldn't bear the thought of all that truth simply ceasing to exist, all those names and stories and documented crimes vanishing as if they'd never been real. So he continued, not because he believed it would lead anywhere, but because the alternative, silence, forgetfulness, complicity without even the consolation of hidden truth, felt worse. He continued because numbers didn't lie, even when no one was listening to what those numbers said. He continued because someone needed to remember, even if that someone was only himself. And then, in May of 1858, everything changed. A stranger arrived at Riverside Plantation, a man with credentials from the Charleston government office, claiming to be conducting routine financial audits of major plantations in the region. His name was James Hartford. And though Samuel didn't know it yet, Hartford would become the person who finally gave purpose to 10 years of secret documentation. The opportunity Martha had predicted was finally arriving, and Samuel would soon have to decide whether survival was still the most important thing, or whether he was willing to risk everything for the chance that truth might actually matter. James Hartford arrived on a Tuesday morning in May 1858, driving his own carriage up the long oak-lined drive to Riverside's main house. He was a tall, lean man in his mid-40s, dressed in a sober, dark suit that marked him as a professional of some kind. His face had the kind of weathered quality that suggested time spent outdoors, despite his obviously urban occupation, and his eyes held a sharp, assessing quality that made Samuel's instincts prickle with alertness. Fairchild met Hartford at the door with forced cordiality. Samuel watched from the hallway, ostensibly polishing silver, but actually observing the interaction with keen interest. "Mr. Fairchild, I'm James Hartford, tax assessor from the Charleston Revenue Office." Hartford presented official-looking documents. "I'm here to conduct a financial audit of your plantation's operations." Fairchild's face went through a rapid series of expressions, surprise, alarm, then smoothing into practiced calm. "This is highly irregular, Mr. Hartford. I wasn't notified of any scheduled audit." "Audits are by their nature unscheduled, sir. We found that advance notice compromises the accuracy of our assessments." Hartford's tone was polite but firm, the voice of someone accustomed to authority. "I have authorization from the State Revenue Office to examine your financial records for the past 5 years. I'm sure you'll want to cooperate fully." It wasn't really a request. Fairchild's jaw tightened, but he stepped back to admit Hartford. "Of course, though I assure you my records are in perfect order. My bookkeeper is exceptionally skilled." "I'm sure he is. Nevertheless, I'll need to verify that personally. Standard procedure." Samuel continued his work, his heart beginning to race. An audit. An official government audit of Riverside's finances. The timing seemed almost supernatural, just when Fairchild's frauds had reached their peak, just when the discrepancies between official records and reality had become impossible to hide completely. But Samuel forced himself to remain calm. This might mean nothing. Tax audits focused on whether taxes had been paid correctly, not on fraud against private investors or theft from family trusts. Hartford might examine the books, find some minor tax discrepancies, assess a penalty, and leave without ever discovering the depth of Fairchild's criminal activities. Or Hartford might be very good at his job and notice things that would raise questions. Over the next 3 days, Hartford took up residence in Riverside's guest room and began a systematic examination of every ledger, every receipt, every document related to the plantation's finances. Fairchild hovered anxiously, offering explanations, justifications, occasionally outright lies that Hartford accepted with polite nods while making notes in a small leather-bound journal he carried constantly. Samuel was required to assist with the audit, bringing Hartford any documents he requested, answering questions about the accounting methods used, explaining various entries. It put him in a peculiar position. He was being asked to support the fiction he'd been forced to create in the official books, while privately knowing the truth documented in his hidden ledgers. Hartford was cordial but distant in his interactions with Samuel, treating him with the same polite disinterest he showed to all the enslaved workers at Riverside. He asked precise questions, listened to Samuel's answers, and made notes without commentary. But Samuel noticed things. Small things that most people would miss. He noticed that Hartford's questions weren't random. They followed a pattern, focusing especially on entries related to cotton sales, asset valuations, and transactions with specific creditors and investors. As if Hartford was looking for something particular rather than conducting a general audit. He noticed that Hartford's leather satchel contained not just blank paper and writing implements, but also letters and documents that seemed to relate to other plantations, other investigations. This wasn't Hartford's only audit. And most significantly, on the 4th day of the audit, Samuel noticed something that changed everything. He was retrieving a requested ledger from 1855 when he saw Hartford's satchel sitting partially open on the side table in the study. Inside, just visible, was a newspaper from a northern state. Samuel couldn't see the full masthead, but he caught part of a headline. "Abolition Society demands federal investigation into Southern property claims." Samuel's hands froze on the ledger he'd been reaching for. His mind raced, connecting pieces of information that suddenly formed a very different picture than he'd been assuming. Hartford wasn't just a tax assessor, or rather, he was a tax assessor, but that wasn't his only purpose here. He was looking for something specific, something related to property claims, something that abolition societies in the North cared about. He was looking for fraud, for evidence of criminal activity, for ammunition that could be used not just to collect unpaid taxes, but to expose the financial corruption underlying the entire system. Samuel completed his task, handing the ledger to Hartford with steady hands, despite the thoughts racing through his mind, then returned to his other duties with his heart pounding. That night, unable to sleep, Samuel lay in his small room and faced a decision that terrified him. He had evidence. 10 years of meticulously documented evidence showing exactly the kind of fraud that Hartford seemed to be investigating. Evidence detailed enough to verify, comprehensive enough to build a case, damning enough to destroy Fairchild completely. But revealing that evidence meant revealing himself. admitting that he'd been keeping secret records for a decade, putting himself in extraordinary danger. If Hartford was truly what he seemed, an honest investigator looking for evidence of fraud, then Samuel's ledgers could be invaluable, could turn a routine audit into a criminal prosecution, could bring Fairchild to justice in a way that seemed impossible otherwise. But if Samuel was wrong about Hartford, if he misjudged the man's character or intentions, then showing him the hidden ledgers would result in their destruction and Samuel's punishment, possibly his sale to somewhere far worse than Riverside, possibly worse than Sale. Martha's words echoed in his memory. Maybe someday an opportunity will come, and maybe when that happens, you'll need to decide if survival is still the most important thing. This was that moment, that opportunity, that choice. Samuel wrestled with the decision all night, examining it from every angle, weighing risks against possible rewards, trying to calculate odds that were fundamentally incalculable. By morning, he still hadn't decided. He went about his usual duties in a fog of indecision and anxiety, barely able to focus on the work in front of him. But that afternoon, something happened that made his decision for him. Hartford had been examining the 1856 ledgers in detail, cross-referencing entries with receipts and shipping records. Suddenly, he looked up at Samuel, who was organizing documents across the room. "Samuel, come here, please." Samuel approached the desk, his stomach knotted with tension. Hartford pointed to an entry from September 1856. This notation indicates a sale of 3 workers to a trader named Colburn, with a combined loss of property value recorded at $2,100. But I don't see any corresponding income recorded from the sale. If property was sold, where did the money go? It was the exact transaction that Samuel had documented in his third hidden ledger, the sale that Fairchild had conducted secretly, using property that was technically co-owned by investors, pocketing the cash without reporting it as income. The real sale price had been $2,050, not $2,100, and the entire transaction was fraudulent in multiple ways. Samuel stood there, acutely aware that Fairchild was in the room, listening, ready to provide an explanation that would be plausible enough to satisfy Hartford's question. That was a trade, not a cash sale. Fairchild interjected smoothly, before Samuel could speak. "I received 3 younger workers in exchange, which balanced the property values. The new acquisitions are recorded in the October entries." Hartford flipped to October, examined the entries, nodded. "I see. Thank you for clarifying." But Samuel saw it. The brief flicker in Hartford's eyes that suggested he didn't entirely believe Fairchild's explanation. The way Hartford made a particular notation in his journal, marking something for further investigation. Hartford knew something was wrong. He just couldn't prove it from the official records alone. In that moment, Samuel made his decision. That night, well past midnight when he was certain the main house was silent, Samuel carefully removed one of his hidden ledgers from beneath the floorboard under his bed. Not the most damning one, not yet, but one that would clearly show the discrepancies in Fairchild's accounting. One that would prove the official books were falsified. He chose Ledger 4, which covered 1855-1857 and contained detailed documentation of unreported sales, false production numbers, and misappropriation of funds. It was comprehensive enough to be convincing, but not so extensive that Hartford would be overwhelmed. Samuel wrapped the ledger in cloth to muffle any sound, then slipped through the dark corridors of the main house to the guest room where Hartford was staying. His hands were shaking. His heart hammered so hard he felt dizzy. This was the most dangerous thing he'd ever done. He knocked softly, barely breathing, ready to run if his calculations had been wrong. The door opened after a long moment. Hartford stood there in his nightshirt, a candle in his hand, his expression shifting from annoyance to surprise when he saw who was standing in the hallway. "What is it, boy? Does your master need something at this hour?" Samuel knew he had only seconds to make his case before Hartford dismissed him. So he held up the wrapped ledger and said the only thing he could think to say, the only words that might make Hartford listen. "These are the real numbers, sir. The ones he doesn't want you to see." The hallway went completely silent. Hartford's expression changed, his eyes dropping to the wrapped bundle in Samuel's hands, then back to Samuel's face. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Hartford stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in, quickly." Samuel entered the room, his legs shaking. Hartford closed the door carefully, quietly, then turned to face Samuel with an intensity that hadn't been there during any of their previous interactions. "What you're holding," Hartford said slowly. "Explain it to me." "It's a ledger, sir. My own ledger. I've been keeping separate records for 10 years, documenting the real transactions, the ones Master Fairchild hides from the official books. The frauds he commits." Hartford's eyes narrowed. "And why would you do that?" "Because someone needed to remember the truth, sir. And I'm the only one who could." "Give it to me." Samuel handed over the ledger. Hartford took it to the small desk by the window, lit additional candles for better light, and began to read. Samuel watched as the tax assessor's expression shifted from skepticism to concentration, to something darker. Hartford flipped through pages, his finger tracing down columns of numbers, his jaw tightening as he cross-referenced entries with notes from his own investigation. Minutes passed, then 10 minutes, then 20. Hartford read with absolute focus, occasionally making notations in his own journal, sometimes returning to earlier pages to verify connections. Finally, he looked up at Samuel with an expression that might have been awe. "These numbers, they're in your handwriting, the same handwriting as the official ledgers." "Yes, sir." "But these entries don't appear in the books Fairchild has shown me." "These are..." Hartford paused, seeming to search for words. "These are documentation of systematic fraud, tax evasion, misrepresentation to investors, theft of co-owned property. This is a criminal enterprise documented from the inside." "Yes, sir." Hartford studied Samuel with new eyes, perhaps for the first time truly seeing him as something more than just another piece of Riverside's inventory. "You understand what you're showing me? The extraordinary danger you're in by bringing this to my attention?" "Yes, sir. I understand. Why should I believe these numbers are real? You could have fabricated all of this. Could be attempting to frame your master for crimes he didn't commit." Samuel had anticipated this question. He'd thought about it during the long, sleepless night before making his decision. "Page 15, sir. The entry for September 1856. The sale of 3 people to a trader named Colburn." "Master Fairchild told you today that it was a trade, not a cash sale. That's a lie, sir. I've written here Colburn's full business address in Savannah. If you contact him, he can verify the transaction and the exact price paid, $2,150, which never appeared in any of Master Fairchild's reported income for that year. He'll have his own records of the purchase." Hartford turned to page 15, studied the entry. "And you have more verifiable transactions like this?" "Dozens, sir. Names, addresses, dates, amounts. Every entry in this ledger can be verified through external sources. I made sure of that." "And you have more of these? More ledgers with this kind of information?" Samuel took a deep breath. This was the moment of complete commitment, the point of no return. 6 books, sir, covering different aspects of his frauds. Financial crimes, unreported sales, theft from his wife's family trust, potential witnesses, 10 years of documentation, hundreds of verifiable discrepancies, names, dates, amounts, evidence. Hartford closed the ledger carefully and looked at Samuel for a long moment. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why did you do this? What did you hope to accomplish?" It was the question Samuel had been asking himself for 10 years. Why had he done this? What had he been hoping for? He'd never quite been able to articulate it, even to himself, had never found words adequate to explain the compulsion that had driven him to document truth that might never matter. But standing there in that small room, facing a man who might actually have the power to do something with that truth. Samuel finally understood his own motivations clearly enough to express them. Because numbers don't lie, sir. People lie. Master Fairchild lies every day to his investors, to his creditors, to his family, to the government. But the numbers tell the truth, if someone bothers to read them properly. And I thought, maybe someday someone would want to know the truth. Someone who could actually do something about it. He paused, then added more quietly, and because I needed to remember that I was more than just property, that I could think and observe and document, that I had a mind that mattered, even if nobody else thought so. Even if those ledgers never changed anything, they proved to me that I was a person who could witness and remember and record, that my understanding of these numbers meant something. Hartford was silent for a long time, his expression unreadable in the flickering candlelight. Then he asked, "Do you know what will happen if I use this information? To you?" "I'll likely be sold, sir. Best case. I'm currently classified as Master Fairchild's property, but if he's arrested, his assets will be seized to pay his debts. I'll be auctioned along with everything else. And you're willing to accept that? To give up whatever stability you have here for the uncertain possibility that your documentation might lead to prosecution." Samuel thought about that, thought about the life he'd built at Riverside, limited and constrained as it was. He had privileges that most enslaved people didn't have. His own room, indoor work, respect for his skills, even if not for his humanity. He had Martha, the closest thing to family he'd known since being separated from his mother. He had a certain measure of security, knowing what to expect from each day. Bringing down Fairchild would destroy all of that, would plunge Samuel into uncertainty, likely hardship, possibly worse conditions than he currently endured. But he thought about something else too, about the names in his ledgers, the people sold away, separated from families, worked until they died without dignity or acknowledgement, about Thomas, dismissed and disgraced for discrepancies he hadn't created, about Eleanor, robbed by her own husband with no recourse, about every victim of Fairchild's frauds and cruelties who deserved justice but would never receive it if someone didn't speak up. "I'm willing, sir," Samuel said quietly. "Whatever happens to me afterward, at least the truth will be told. At least the numbers will finally speak where someone can hear them." Hartford nodded slowly, his expression grave. "Then bring me the other books tomorrow night, all of them, and don't breathe a word of this to anyone. Not the other workers, not your master, not anyone. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir." "Samuel?" Hartford hesitated, then said something that surprised Samuel with its humanity. "Thank you. What you've done here, what you're risking, it matters. I want you to know that. Win or lose, succeed or fail, what you've documented matters." Samuel felt something tighten in his chest, felt unexpected tears prickling at his eyes. For 10 years, he'd worked in secret, uncertain whether his documentation had any meaning at all. And now someone was telling him it mattered. Someone with authority, with power, with the ability to actually use what Samuel had preserved. "Thank you, sir," he managed to say. He returned to his room in a daze, carefully hiding the remaining 5 ledgers again, then lying in his bed unable to sleep, his mind racing with possibilities and fears and a strange, fragile hope he'd almost forgotten how to feel. The next night, he brought Hartford all 5 remaining ledgers. They spent 3 hours together, Hartford reading while Samuel explained the organization system, the cross-references, the sources for verification. Hartford made extensive notes, asked hundreds of questions, occasionally pausing to stare at Samuel with something like amazement. "This is extraordinary," Hartford said, as the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky outside. "I've conducted dozens of audits, exposed multiple cases of fraud and embezzlement, but I've never seen anything like this. The thoroughness, the attention to detail, the foresight to document verifiable sources. This is the work of a professional investigator, not..." He trailed off, perhaps realizing the insult implicit in completing that sentence. "Not a slave with no formal education," Samuel finished for him quietly. "I know what you mean, sir. No offense taken." Hartford looked uncomfortable. "I shouldn't have implied." "You should use what I've given you," Samuel interrupted, not wanting to have a conversation about Hartford's surprise at Samuel's capabilities. "That's what matters. The evidence is solid. The frauds are extensive. Master Fairchild has committed crimes against investors, creditors, the government, his own family. He's used people as collateral who don't exist. Reported income he never earned. Hidden assets he doesn't own. It's all documented, all verifiable. I'll need to contact multiple sources to verify the most significant claims," Hartford said. "Back to business. That will take several weeks, perhaps longer. And I'll need to present my findings to the federal prosecutor in Charleston, get authorization for formal charges. This isn't just a tax matter anymore, Samuel. This is criminal fraud on a scale that will require federal prosecution." "How long?" 2 months at minimum, possibly 3. During that time, you need to act completely normal. Continue your duties. Maintain the official books exactly as Fairchild expects. Give no indication that anything has changed. Can you do that?" Samuel thought about it. 2 or 3 months of carrying on, as if he hadn't just handed over 10 years of secret documentation. 2 or 3 months of maintaining the fiction while knowing that it was all coming apart. 2 or 3 months of working beside Fairchild, recording his lies, wondering every day if somehow Fairchild had discovered what Samuel had done. "I can do it, sir." Hartford studied him for a long moment. "You're a remarkable person, Samuel. I hope you know that." Samuel didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. He simply gathered up the ledgers. Hartford would keep them secure, would protect them as evidence, and return to his small room as the sun began to rise. He'd done it. He'd taken the step that couldn't be undone. He'd given Hartford everything he'd been secretly building for a decade. Now all he could do was wait. Wait to see if Hartford was as honest as Samuel believed. Wait to see if the evidence would be enough. Wait to see what would happen when the truth he'd preserved for so long finally emerged into the light. Wait to see if numbers, carefully recorded and patiently accumulated, could really destroy a plantation built on lies. The next 2 months were the longest of Samuel's life. Every day felt like walking on a tightrope, maintaining absolute normalcy while knowing that everything was about to change. He worked in the study recording Fairchild's transactions, his hands steady and his face neutral, even as his stomach churned with anxiety. He assisted with the plantation's daily operations, his manner as efficient and unobtrusive as always. He gave no indication that anything was different, but everything was different, and the strain of pretending otherwise wore on him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Hartford had left Riverside Plantation 4 days after Samuel gave him the ledgers, cordially thanking Fairchild for his cooperation and assuring him that a formal report would be sent within the month. Fairchild had been visibly relieved, convinced that he'd successfully concealed his financial misdeeds from scrutiny. That could have been much worse, Fairchild had said to Eleanor over dinner that evening, his voice carrying through the house. Hartford found a few minor discrepancies, nothing significant. "We'll receive a small penalty for underreported income, but nothing we can't manage. The important thing is that he didn't detect any of the more complex aspects of our accounting." Samuel, serving the meal in silence, had to fight to keep his expression blank. The weeks crawled by. Samuel maintained his routines, continued his work, and tried not to think about what was happening in Charleston as Hartford verified the information from the hidden ledgers. Tried not to imagine all the ways this could fail. Hartford losing interest, the evidence being deemed insufficient, the people Samuel had listed as witnesses refusing to cooperate or having records that didn't match Samuel's documentation. Martha knew something had changed. She could see it in Samuel's eyes, in the tension he carried in his shoulders, in the way he sometimes seemed to be listening for something no one else could hear. "You did it," she said to him quietly one evening. "It wasn't a question." I don't know what you mean. Don't play games with me, child. You showed someone those books you've been keeping. That inspector. Samuel glanced around to ensure they were alone, then nodded. I did. And now we wait. Either it was enough, or it wasn't. Martha pulled him into a tight embrace, something she rarely did where others might see. You're braver than your mama ever got a chance to be, she whispered. I'm proud of you. No matter what happens next, I want you to know that. I'm terrified, Martha. Good. Means you're smart enough to understand the risk, but you did it anyway. That's what courage is, being terrified and doing the right thing anyway. The formal report arrived 6 weeks after Hartford's departure. It came not to Fairchild, but directly to federal marshals in Charleston, accompanied by warrants for arrest and seizure. On a hot morning in July 1858, 3 federal marshals arrived at Riverside Plantation with documents authorizing them to take Robert Fairchild into custody and freeze all of the plantation's financial assets, pending investigation. They were accompanied by James Hartford, by representatives from 2 of the Charleston banks to which Fairchild owed money, and by a lawyer representing a coalition of investors who'd been defrauded. Samuel was in the study when they arrived, recording supply purchases in the official ledger when he heard the commotion in the front hall. Raised voices, Fairchild shouting, Eleanor crying. The heavy footsteps of multiple men entering the house. He set down his pen with shaking hands and waited. The study door opened. Hartford entered, followed by 2 marshals. Fairchild came behind them, his face flushed red with rage and shock. You, Fairchild spat, looking directly at Samuel. His eyes were wild, desperate. You did this. My bookkeeper, my accountant, I gave you everything. I taught you. I trusted you. Samuel stood up slowly, forcing himself to meet Fairchild's gaze. You taught me to keep accurate records, sir. That's exactly what I did. One of the marshals stepped between them before Fairchild could lunge toward Samuel. Mr. Fairchild, you're under arrest on federal charges of fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion. You need to come with us. This is outrageous. Based on what evidence? The lies of a slave? His testimony isn't even admissible in court. The evidence isn't testimony, Hartford said calmly. It's documentation. 10 years of meticulous records, all verified through external sources. Bank records, shipping manifests, purchase receipts, witness statements from traders and merchants across 3 states. Every claim has been corroborated. Your official ledgers are fiction, Mr. Fairchild, and now we can prove it. The color drained from Fairchild's face as the full scope of what had happened finally registered. The ledgers, Samuel's other ledgers, are now federal evidence in a criminal prosecution, Hartford finished, along with testimony from 17 independent witnesses who've confirmed various fraudulent transactions. You're finished, Fairchild. They led him away in chains. Samuel watched from the study window as Fairchild was placed in a wagon, still protesting, still refusing to accept the reality of his situation. Eleanor followed in her own carriage, already consulting with the family lawyer who'd been hastily summoned. And then they were gone, and Riverside Plantation fell into a strange, suspended silence. Hartford remained behind with a court-appointed trustee who would manage the plantation's affairs pending the trial. The trustee, a businesslike man named Peters from Charleston, began immediately cataloging assets, freezing accounts, and preparing for what would be an extensive legal process to untangle Fairchild's fraudulent finances. Samuel was ordered to assist with the inventory, his knowledge of the plantation's operations being deemed too valuable to waste. He spent the next several weeks working with Peters and Hartford, explaining entries in both the official and hidden ledgers, helping identify which assets actually existed versus which were phantom inventory reported for fraud. It was surreal. For 10 years, Samuel had been the invisible force documenting Fairchild's crimes in secret. Now he was openly working with federal investigators, his hidden ledgers spread across the study desk alongside the official books, his expertise sought out and valued by men who would normally never consider an enslaved person's knowledge worth consulting. But Samuel wasn't free. That was the bitter irony of the entire situation. Yes, he'd brought down Fairchild. Yes, his documentation had exposed crimes that would likely result in years of prison time. Yes, he'd achieved something that had seemed impossible, using nothing but accurate record-keeping to destroy a corrupt plantation operation. But legally, Samuel was still property. And with Fairchild's assets frozen, Samuel fell under the jurisdiction of the court as part of the estate that would eventually be liquidated to pay creditors, which meant Samuel would be sold. Hartford broke the news to him 3 days after Fairchild's arrest. They were in the study reviewing entries from 1856 when Hartford set down his pen and looked at Samuel with genuine regret. "The trial will take months, possibly longer," Hartford said. "Fairchild has retained expensive lawyers who will fight every charge, but eventually he'll be convicted. The evidence is overwhelming. When that happens, his assets will be liquidated to pay his creditors, and legally, Samuel, you're classified as one of those assets." Samuel had known this was coming, had accepted it as the inevitable cost of his choice to come forward, but hearing it stated so plainly still felt like a blow. "I understand, sir. I've tried to find a way around it," Hartford continued. "I argued that you should be freed as compensation for your cooperation with the investigation, but the courts won't do it. You're worth too much. The creditors won't give up that value." "How much am I worth?" Samuel asked. He was 24 years old, skilled in accounting and literacy, young enough to work for decades. He knew his value would be high. "The trustee has assessed you at $1,800, possibly more at auction given your unique abilities." $1,800, more than twice what most field workers would fetch. A substantial asset that the creditors weren't willing to sacrifice for something as abstract as justice or gratitude. "When will the auction be?" "Not until after the trial concludes and the liquidation is authorized by the court. That gives us time. I'm going to try something, Samuel. I can't promise it will work, but I'm going to contact abolition societies in the North. Tell them your story. See if we can raise funds to purchase your freedom." Samuel looked at Hartford in surprise. "You would do that for me? You exposed one of the largest fraud cases this state has seen in years. You've provided documentation that will help recover losses for dozens of defrauded investors, and you did it at extraordinary personal risk, knowing you'd likely lose everything. Yes, Samuel, I would do that for you. You deserve better than to be sold at auction like livestock." Over the following months, as Fairchild's trial proceeded in Charleston, Hartford kept his promise. He wrote to abolition societies in Boston, New York, Philadelphia. He told them Samuel's story, the enslaved bookkeeper who documented his master's crimes for a decade, who'd used his gift with numbers to bring down a corrupt plantation, who now faced being sold despite his cooperation with justice. The response was overwhelming. Northern newspapers picked up the story. The accountant, they called him, fascinated by the narrative of an enslaved man using precise record-keeping as a form of resistance. Abolition societies saw him as a perfect example of the intelligence and capability that slavery tried to deny and suppress. Letters poured in expressing support. Some included small donations toward purchasing Samuel's freedom. Others offered assistance with relocation if freedom could be secured. But the donations came in slowly. $5 here, $10 there. By September 1858, the fund stood at only $340, nowhere near the $1,800 that would be needed. Meanwhile, Samuel continued working at Riverside, now managing the plantation's accounts for the court trustee instead of for Fairchild. It was strange to be doing essentially the same work, but with completely different purpose, maintaining accurate books rather than covering up frauds, documenting reality rather than creating fiction. Fairchild's trial began in October 1858 and lasted 7 weeks. Samuel was called to testify, though his testimony was limited to explaining the accounting methods used and confirming that the hidden ledgers were in his handwriting. His actual observations about Fairchild's crimes weren't admissible as testimony. Enslaved people couldn't testify against white people in criminal proceedings, but the ledgers themselves were admissible as evidence. And Hartford had done his work thoroughly, verifying every major claim through independent sources. Trader Colburn testified about the unreported 1856 sale. Bank representatives testified about loans obtained using false asset valuations. Merchants testified about forged receipts and fictitious transactions. The prosecution built an overwhelming case, using Samuel's documentation as the foundation upon which all other evidence was structured. Fairchild was convicted on November 28, 1858, on 17 counts of fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion. He was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison and ordered to repay $73,000 in restitution to various victims of his crimes. It was over. Samuel had won. Except he hadn't. Not really. Because winning meant Fairchild going to prison while Samuel still faced being sold. The liquidation of Fairchild's estate was scheduled for March 1859. All of Riverside's assets would be auctioned to the highest bidders, with the proceeds going to pay creditors. The plantation itself would be broken up and sold in sections. Equipment, livestock, and enslaved people would all go under the hammer. Samuel had 5 months. Hartford redoubled his efforts to raise funds for Samuel's freedom. He wrote more letters, gave interviews to northern newspapers, even traveled to Boston to speak at an Abolition Society meeting, bringing Samuel's hidden ledgers to show as proof of what one determined person could accomplish even under the most oppressive circumstances. The donations increased, but painfully slowly. By February 1859, the fund stood at $920, still $1,000 short of what would be needed. Samuel tried to maintain hope, but it became harder as the auction date approached. He'd done everything he could, had risked everything, had achieved the seemingly impossible goal of bringing Fairchild to justice. And his reward was to be sold away from the only home he'd known for 17 years, away from Martha and the few other people he cared about, to an unknown fate with an unknown buyer. "Maybe it's enough," Martha said to him one evening, a week before the scheduled auction. Maybe bringing him down was enough, even if you don't get freedom. "Maybe," Samuel said, but he didn't believe it. It didn't feel like enough. It felt like a story that ended too soon, with the victory incomplete. "I'm proud of you," Martha said again, as she'd said many times over the past months. "Your mama would be proud too, wherever she is. You did something that mattered, Samuel. Don't let anyone tell you different." The auction was set for March 3, 1859. As the date approached, Samuel found himself surprisingly calm. He'd done what he could. The rest was out of his hands. On March 1st, 2 days before the auction, Hartford arrived at Riverside in a hurry, his face flushed with exertion and excitement. "Samuel!" he called out as soon as he saw him. "Where's Peters? Where's the trustee?" "In the main house, sir." "What's happened?" But Hartford was already striding toward the house, and Samuel followed quickly, his heart beginning to race with something that might have been hope. Peters was in the study, reviewing final auction documents. Hartford burst in without knocking, startling the trustee. "I have a buyer for Samuel," Hartford announced. "Someone willing to pay above the assessed value if the sale can be conducted privately before the auction." Peters frowned. "I can't give special treatment, Mr. Hartford. The auction is in 2 days. This buyer is offering $2,200 for Samuel specifically, with the understanding that he'll be immediately manumitted upon sale. That's $400 above your assessed value, benefiting the creditors and resolving a complicated situation before the public auction. You'd be a fool not to accept." Samuel's breath caught. $2,200 and immediate manumission? Who would possibly? "Who's the buyer?" Peters asked. Hartford pulled out documents. "The Massachusetts Abolition Society, acting through me as their legal representative. The funds have been raised through donations over the past 5 months. I have bank drafts here covering the full amount." Peters examined the documents, his expression skeptical. "This is highly irregular, but entirely legal. I've checked with 3 lawyers. You're authorized to sell estate assets to pay creditors. I'm offering to purchase one specific asset at above market value, with payment in full immediately. There's no legal basis to refuse. Samuel stood frozen, unable to speak, barely able to breathe. Freedom. Real freedom. Not someday, not as an abstract possibility, but in 2 days if this sale went through. Peters consulted his documents, made some calculations, then finally nodded slowly. Very well. If the Massachusetts Abolition Society is willing to pay $2,200 for this particular asset, I'm authorized to accept. The sale can be concluded tomorrow, and manumission papers filed immediately thereafter. Hartford turned to Samuel with a genuine smile. Pack your things. You're leaving Riverside as a free man. Samuel walked out of Riverside Plantation for the last time on March 2nd, 1859, carrying a small bag containing the few possessions he owned and the most precious thing he'd ever possessed, manumission papers legally documenting his freedom. He was 25 years old. He'd spent 17 years enslaved, the last 12 of those years documenting the truth that would eventually set him free. Martha was there to see him off, tears streaming down her weathered face. "You go make something of yourself," she said, holding him tight. "You go show the world what you're capable of when nobody owns you." "Come with me," Samuel said. He'd been thinking about this since Hartford told him about the sale. "We can raise funds for your freedom too, the Abolition Society." But Martha shook her head. "I'm too old, child, and I got family here, grandchildren in the fields. I can't leave them. But you go. You live free enough for both of us. You tell people what happened here. You make those numbers mean something." Samuel left Riverside with Hartford, traveling to Charleston and from there to Boston by ship. It was his first time leaving South Carolina, his first time seeing the ocean, his first time experiencing the strange reality of being free. In Boston, he was welcomed by the Massachusetts Abolition Society as a hero of sorts. His story had been circulating in northern newspapers for months. The enslaved accountant who documented his master's crimes with such precision that he'd brought down an entire plantation operation. The Abolition Society had work for him immediately. They needed someone to manage their finances, someone who understood accounting and could be trusted with their funds. Samuel took the position gratefully, finally using his skills for a cause he believed in rather than to perpetuate a system he hated. But he didn't want his story to end there. He wanted to do more with what he'd learned and documented. In 1860, Samuel began giving talks at Abolition Society meetings describing the economic mechanics of slavery from an insider's perspective. He brought his original ledgers. Hartford had managed to secure their return after Fairchild's trial concluded, and showed audiences exactly how human beings were reduced to numbers, how cruelty was calculated in profit margins, how an entire system of oppression ran on coldly precise mathematics. "Numbers don't lie," he would tell audiences, but they also don't tell the whole story. Behind every entry in these books is a person, a life, a story. That's what people need to understand. Slavery isn't just morally wrong, though it absolutely is. It's also economically built on fraud and lies and theft. Even by the standards of the system itself, it's corrupt. His talks were powerful, drawing large crowds. Here was someone who'd seen slavery's machinery from the inside, who could explain exactly how it functioned and why it was unsustainable, even on its own terms. When the Civil War began in April 1861, Samuel volunteered to help in any way he could. He ended up working for the War Department, helping to manage supply logistics and accounts for Union forces. His gift with numbers and his understanding of Southern plantation economics made him valuable in planning strategies to disrupt Confederate supply chains. He married in 1863 a woman named Grace, who'd been born free in Pennsylvania, who shared his passion for education and justice. They had 3 children together, all of whom Samuel taught to read and write and calculate, ensuring they would have the tools to build whatever futures they wanted. After the war, Samuel continued working for abolition causes, transitioning to focus on education for formerly enslaved people. He taught accounting and literacy, believing that economic independence required understanding how money and business worked. He never forgot Riverside, never forgot the people he documented in his hidden ledgers. As he aged, he made efforts to locate some of them, the ones who'd been sold away, scattered across the South. He succeeded in finding a few, helping them reconnect with family members they'd been separated from for years. Robert Fairchild served 3 years of his 4-year sentence before being released in 1862. He emerged from prison bankrupt and disgraced, his social standing destroyed, his reputation ruined. He attempted to rebuild his life in Charleston, but found that no one wanted to do business with a convicted fraud. He died in 1871, bitter and alone, still refusing to acknowledge that his downfall had been his own doing. Eleanor had fared better, ironically. With Robert in prison, she'd successfully sued to recover what remained of her stolen trust fund, and she'd eventually remarried, this time to a Charleston merchant who treated her with considerably more respect than her first husband had shown. Riverside Plantation itself ceased to exist as a functioning operation by 1864. The land had been subdivided during liquidation, sold to multiple buyers who ran smaller farms. The main house burned down in 1879 under circumstances that were never fully explained, though some suspected arson by formerly enslaved people who wanted to see that symbol of their oppression destroyed. But Samuel's ledgers survived. Hartford had ensured they were preserved, donating them to the Massachusetts Abolition Society archives. After the war, they were transferred to what eventually became the Boston African American History Museum, where they remain to this day. 6 leather-bound books, filled with careful handwriting, documenting 12 years of a plantation's operations with devastating accuracy. They've been studied by historians, economists, sociologists. They've been exhibited in museums, digitized for researchers around the world, cited in countless academic works about the economics of slavery. They remain some of the most detailed first-hand accounts of slavery's financial mechanics ever recorded. Not from an outside observer, but from someone who managed the system from within while secretly documenting its corruption. Samuel lived to the age of 63, dying in Boston in 1897. He'd spent the last decades of his life teaching, writing, and occasionally speaking about his experiences. He'd published a memoir in 1882 titled The Accountant's Ledger, A Slave's Mathematical Resistance, which became moderately successful and helped preserve his story for future generations. In his final years, he would sometimes take out his original ledgers and read through them, remembering the people whose names he'd preserved, the struggles he'd witnessed, the long, patient work of documenting truth when no one was listening. Visitors would ask him what he was most proud of: bringing down Fairchild, gaining his freedom, helping with the Union war effort, teaching hundreds of formerly enslaved people to read and calculate. But Samuel's answer was always the same: I'm most proud that I remembered, that I wrote it down, that I made sure the truth existed somewhere, even when it seemed like no one cared. Because numbers don't lie, and neither do the names of people who deserved to be remembered as people, not property. On his deathbed, surrounded by his children and grandchildren, Samuel made one final request: that his ledgers be preserved forever, kept accessible to anyone who wanted to understand what slavery really looked like from the inside. "Let those numbers speak," he whispered. "Let them tell the story I spent 12 years recording. Let them remember when human memory fails." His family honored that request. The ledgers remained in the museum's collection, carefully preserved, occasionally exhibited, always available to researchers and students, and anyone curious about this particular story of resistance through documentation. And they're still there today, more than a century after Samuel's death. 6 books that destroyed a plantation, preserved a truth that powerful people wanted hidden, and proved that sometimes the most powerful act of resistance is simply refusing to let the truth be forgotten. Samuel was right about one thing: numbers don't lie. But he was also right about something deeper, something more important. Numbers alone aren't enough. Behind every figure, every calculation, every entry in a ledger, There are people, lives, stories that deserve to be told and remembered. That's what Samuel did with his 12 years of patient documentation. He didn't just record frauds and crimes, though he did that thoroughly. He also recorded humanity in a system designed to deny it. He remembered names when people were reduced to property values. He documented stories when lives were supposed to be forgotten. He proved that even in the most oppressive circumstances, even as someone classified as property rather than person, one individual with skill and determination and patience could make truth matter. Not by violence, not by rebellion, but by the simple, stubborn act of bearing witness, of writing down what happened, of keeping accurate records, of refusing to let lies stand unchallenged, even when challenging them took 12 years of secret work. That's the legacy of the man known as the accountant. Not just that he brought down a corrupt plantation, though he did that. Not just that he gained his freedom, though he achieved that too. His legacy is that he proved the power of documentation itself. The power of patient, methodical truth-telling. The power of one person who refuses to forget, who records what others want hidden, who believes that someday, somehow, the truth will matter. And he was right. The truth did matter. It took 12 years, but it mattered. The numbers spoke, and they destroyed everything built on lies.